I want to make a case, not an argument, not a debate. A case, the way you'd present one to someone who is genuinely trying to figure out what's true, rather than looking for confirmation of what they already believe. I've spent my career following evidence wherever it leads, without deciding in advance what it has to say. And when I follow the evidence on the question of whether the God of theology, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, eternal, personal God, can exist in the physical universe we actually inhabit, I find 6 specific reasons it can. Not 6 pieces of evidence that make it unlikely. 6 independent physical and logical constraints, each one derived from established principles, each one closing off the possibility from a different direction. I want to be precise about what irrefutable means here. It means these arguments follow necessarily from premises that are themselves among the most thoroughly confirmed results in physics, mathematics, and logic. To refute them, you would have to refute quantum mechanics, information theory, thermodynamics, formal logic, and temporal logic simultaneously. That's not impossible, but nobody has done it. And I'm not holding my breath. 6 proofs. Let's go. Proof 1. Divine simplicity versus representational complexity. The classical theological tradition, going back to Augustine, codified by Thomas Aquinas, maintained by Catholic, Orthodox, and many Protestant traditions, insists on something called divine simplicity. God is not composed of parts. God has no constituents, no properties that are separate from his essence. God is not a collection of attributes that happen to be bundled together. God is absolutely simple, a pure unity without composition, without division, without the kind of structure that would make God a complex system built from simpler components. This is not a peripheral claim. Divine simplicity is foundational to classical theism. It's the basis for arguments that God's omniscience, omnipotence, and goodness are not separate properties but a single undivided essence. Now, information theory, the framework developed by Claude Shannon and extended by subsequent mathematicians, establishes something precise about representation. A system that represents or contains information about another system must be at least as complex as the information it contains. You cannot fit a description of something into a representational system simpler than what you're describing. This is not a practical engineering limitation. It is a mathematical theorem about information. The representation must have sufficient degrees of freedom to encode the represented content. God, being omniscient, knows the complete state of the universe. The universe contains approximately 10 years and 123 bits of information, the Bekenstein bound on the observable universe's information content. God's knowledge of the universe must represent all of that. But divine simplicity requires God to have no complexity, no degrees of freedom, no composition, absolute unity. A representational system with no degrees of freedom, no complexity, can encode exactly 0 bits of information. 0 is not 10 123. Divine simplicity and omniscience are mathematically incompatible. A God simple enough to satisfy classical theism cannot contain enough structure to represent the information required for omniscience. A God complex enough for omniscience cannot satisfy divine simplicity. The Church cannot have both. It claims both. And the information theory says, choose one. The theologian will say, God's knowledge is not like human knowledge. God doesn't represent information the way a computer represents it. God's knowledge is identical with his essence. And here is my response. God's knowledge is not like information, is not an explanation. It is a declaration that God's cognition is exempt from the mathematics of information. But exempting a claim from mathematics is not the same as resolving the contradiction. It is naming the contradiction as a mystery, and calling that naming a solution. That is not a solution. That is the logical contradiction, wearing a theological name. Proof 1 stands. Proof 2. The omnipotence self-limitation paradox. You've heard the colloquial version. Can God make a stone so heavy he can't lift it? It sounds like wordplay, like a trick question designed to confuse rather than illuminate. I want to give you the formal version, because the formal version is not wordplay. It is a genuine logical result. Omnipotence, defined precisely, means, for any logically possible state of affairs, God can bring it about. That's the definition. Any logically possible state. Now, here is a logically possible state of affairs. There exists an entity E such that God cannot affect E. Can I describe this state coherently? Yes, I just did. I can write down the description without contradiction. There is no internal logical inconsistency in the description of an entity that God cannot affect. It's not like a four-sided triangle. There's no hidden contradiction in the concept itself. Therefore, it is a logically possible state of affairs. Therefore, by the definition of omnipotence, God can bring it about. But if God brings it about, if God creates an entity that God cannot affect, then there exists an entity that God cannot affect, which means there is something God cannot do, which contradicts an omnipotence. If God cannot bring it about, then there is a logically possible state of affairs that God cannot actualize, which also contradicts omnipotence. Either way, omnipotence is self-contradictory. This is not the stone paradox. The stone paradox can be deflected by saying, God cannot do logically impossible things. A stone too heavy to lift is a contradiction. Fine, but the entity God cannot affect is not logically contradictory in itself. It becomes contradictory only when combined with omnipotence. The problem is not a contradiction in the concept of the entity. The problem is that omnipotence, when precisely defined, generates a contradiction from within its own definition. The standard theological response: God's omnipotence is the power to do anything consistent with his nature. God cannot create something that limits God because that's contrary to God's nature. But this response effectively redefines omnipotence as power to do anything within certain constraints. That is not omnipotence. That is significant but limited power. And a God with significant but limited power is not the God of classical theism. Either omnipotence is genuine and self-contradictory, or it's limited and not omnipotence. The word omnipotence is either logically incoherent or misapplied. Proof 2 stands. Proof 3. Creation nihilo violets quantum unitarity. The Church teaches that God created the universe from nothing, not from pre-existing matter, not from a prior state, from genuine nothing, ex nihilo, out of nothing. I want to approach this from a direction I haven't used before, not from the direction of causation, what caused the cause, but from the direction of information. Quantum mechanics establishes that the evolution of quantum systems is unitary. Unitary evolution is perfectly information-preserving. The total quantum information in a closed system is conserved. Information cannot be created. Information cannot be destroyed. This principle, the unitarity of quantum evolution, is one of the most fundamental results in quantum mechanics. It has been confirmed in every experiment ever performed. It underlies the entire structure of quantum field theory. Hawking himself was eventually forced to accept it, conceding after 30 years that black holes cannot destroy information. The universe currently contains approximately 10^123 bits of quantum information. Before the creation, nothing, 0 bits, no information, no quantum states, nothing. After the creation, 10^123 bits of quantum information. The creation of the universe, if God created it from nothing, increased the quantum information content of the universe by 10^23 bits. Unitarity says this is impossible. Unitarity says quantum information is conserved. You cannot go from 0 bits to 10^123 bits. That is not evolution, that is creation. And unitary evolution cannot create information from nothing. Now, I previously discussed Vilenkin's quantum cosmology, the idea that the universe tunneled into existence from a quantum state with no space or time. That framework describes the universe as having a non-zero wave function that permits its existence. But even in Vilenkin's framework, The quantum state before the tunneling is not nothing. It is a quantum state with specific properties, governed by specific laws, with a wave function that exists. There is no zero information starting point in Vilenkin. There is a pre-existing quantum structure. The Church's creation ex nihilo is different. It requires a genuinely information zero starting point, absolute nothing, and the generation of 10^123 bits from 0 bits violates the conservation that unitarity demands. The theologian will say, God is not subject to unitarity. God operates outside quantum mechanics. And here I give the same response as always. A God who operates outside quantum mechanics is a God whose interactions with the physical world, whose creation of the physical world, cannot be described by any physical law. A creation event that violates unitarity has no physical mechanism. It is the word creation placed at the point where a physical description would go, with no physical content. That is not an explanation of how the universe came to be. That is a label placed on the absence of an explanation. Proof 3 stands. 3 proofs. Divine simplicity and omniscience are mathematically incompatible. Omnipotence is formally self-contradictory. Creation from nothing violates conservation of quantum information. Proofs 4, 5, and 6 are the ones I find most physically precise. They come from quantum field theory, decision theory, and the thermodynamics of time itself. Subscribe. Back in 30 seconds. Proof 4. QFT locality and omnipresent attention. Quantum field theory is the framework that unifies quantum mechanics and special relativity. It is the most precisely tested theory in the history of science. It describes every interaction we have ever observed between fundamental particles and fields. At the heart of quantum field theory is a principle called locality. Locality says physical interactions happen at points. Fields interact with other fields at the same spacetime location. No influence propagates faster than the speed of light. No physical effect occurs at a distance without a mediating signal traveling between the source and the destination at or below c. This is not an approximation. Locality is not an engineering constraint. It is a fundamental structural requirement of any relativistic quantum field theory. Violating locality would violate special relativity, which would violate the Lorentz invariance that QFT is built on. Every physical interaction we know of, gravitational, electromagnetic, strong nuclear, weak nuclear, is local. Everyone is mediated by fields or particles that propagate at or below the speed of light. Now, God is omnipresent. God attends to every location in the universe simultaneously. God is aware of every event, the falling of every sparrow, as the text says, at every point in space, at every moment in time, simultaneously. This omnipresent attention is not metaphorical in classical theism. It is supposed to be a real, operative, physically efficacious presence. God attends to specific events. God responds to prayer. God sustains the universe moment to moment through continuous creative action. This is a physical claim. It describes a real physical interaction between God and every point in space simultaneously. But every physical interaction is local. Every physical influence propagates at or below c. An attention that is genuinely simultaneous at every point in space cannot propagate at or below c. Light from one side of the observable universe takes 93 billion years to reach the other side. A simultaneous attention at both ends is not something that propagates at c. It is a non-local connection. Non-local connections are excluded from quantum field theory. The response: God is not a field. God is not a particle. God's attention doesn't propagate through space the way a field does. And again, a mode of action that is not a field and not a particle, and doesn't propagate and doesn't obey locality, is a mode of action with no physical description whatsoever. A presence with no physical degrees of freedom, propagating through no field, obeying no locality constraint, has no physical effects. It is physically indistinguishable from absence. An omnipresent God whose presence is physically indistinguishable from absence is not omnipresent in any sense the physics can recognize. Proof 4 stands. Proof 5. Timeless decisions are logical impossibilities. God in classical theism is eternal, outside time, not temporal, not experiencing a sequence of moments, not having a past or future, simply existing in a timeless present that encompasses all of time. This is meant to explain how God can know the future, without the future determining God's nature. It's an elegant solution to several theological problems, but it creates a problem that classical theism has never adequately solved. God decided to create the universe. That sentence requires unpacking. A decision is a transition from one state to another. Before the decision, not deciding. During the decision, deliberating. After the decision, having decided. A decision is inherently temporal. It has a before, a during, and an after. Without temporal structure, decision has no meaning. A being that is in an identical state before, during, and after deciding did not decide. It was simply always in the state of having decided. If God is eternal and timeless, God cannot decide in any meaningful sense. God's relationship to the creation is a fixed, eternal, timeless fact. There was no moment when God considered and chose. There is simply the eternal fact of God in creation, without temporal sequence. But then, what does it mean to say God created the universe? Creation implies temporal priority. The Creator exists before the created. If God and the universe both exist eternally, timelessly, without temporal sequence between them, then God did not create the universe in any sense that gives create its meaning. God and the universe are simply co-eternal facts, one grounded in the other, but without the temporal sequence that makes grounding feel like creation. The theologian responds, God's creative act is timeless. It is an eternal act, not a temporal one. The creation is not preceded by God's deliberation in time. It is grounded in God's timeless essence. But an eternal, timeless grounding relationship is not a creative act. A creative act requires agency, the exercise of a will, the bringing about of something that wasn't there. If the something was always there, timelessly, eternally grounded in God's essence, then God didn't bring it about. It was simply always the case. And if it was simply always the case, the universe is as necessary as God, which contradicts the claim that God created the universe freely out of love, by a sovereign act of will. The classical theist wants God to be both timeless and a free creator. Timelessness excludes the temporal structure that free creation requires. Free creation requires the temporal structure that timelessness excludes. Both cannot be true simultaneously. Proof 5 stands. Proof 6. The eternal God and the causal paradox of time. This is the proof I find most elegant, and the one that closes the case most completely. Causation is directional. Causes precede effects. The thermodynamic arrow of time, the direction entropy increases, is the physical underpinning of the asymmetry between cause and effect. The past is the low entropy state from which the present evolved. The future is the high entropy state toward which the present is evolving. A being embedded in time, a being for whom there is a past and a future, can have causal relationships with events. It can cause things to happen because it exists before those things happen. An eternal being outside time has no past and no future. For such a being, all moments of time are equivalent, equally present, equally real. There is no before from the perspective of a timeless being. But causation requires before. A cause must precede its effect. If the cause and effect are equally present, if there is no temporal ordering between them from the perspective of the causal agent, then there is no causal relationship. There is only simultaneous coexistence. A timeless God cannot cause anything to happen inside time, because causing requires being before, and a timeless being is not before anything. It is co-present with everything. Now add the thermodynamic error, the distinction between past and future, between the direction of causation and the direction of entropy increase, is not a subjective human experience. It is a physical fact about the structure of the universe. Low entropy in the past, higher entropy in the future. Events propagate from low entropy configurations to higher entropy configurations, not in reverse. A being outside time, a being for whom the low entropy past and the high entropy future are equally present, cannot navigate this arrow, cannot distinguish the direction of causation from its reverse, cannot initiate a process that propagates in the future direction rather than the past direction. A timeless God cannot cause the universe to exist, because causation is temporally directed, and a timeless being has no temporal direction. A timeless God cannot answer prayers, because answering requires responding after receiving, and a timeless being has no after. A timeless God cannot create, judge, love, respond, or act in any sense that involves a sequence, and every sense of those words involves a sequence. The eternal, timeless God of classical theism cannot do anything that classical theism requires God to do, because everything classical theism requires God to do is temporal, and a timeless being cannot do temporal things. Proof 6 stands. The disturbance. What surprised me? Here's the thing. I expected the 6 arguments to have more given them. When you push hard on a physical theory that's wrong, it usually resists for a while. There are places where the boundary is fuzzy, where the response can gain some ground, where the argument needs refinement. These 6 don't do that. Divine simplicity and omniscience. The mathematics of information theory is exact. You cannot fit more information into a simpler system. That's not an approximation. The omnipotence paradox. Formal logic doesn't have fuzzy boundaries. Either the self-limitation state is logically possible, or it isn't. I've argued it is. The theological response has never shown it isn't. It has only reasserted that omnipotence doesn't work that way, which is not a logical demonstration. Creation ex nihilo and unitarity. Quantum information conservation has never been violated in any experiment ever performed. Creation of 10^123 bits from 0 requires its violation. UFT locality. The most precisely tested framework in physics. No non-local interactions have ever been observed. Timeless decisions. The temporal structure of deliberation and choice is not a contingent feature of human cognition. It is the logical structure of what decision means. The causal paradox. Thermodynamic arrow is a physical fact. Causation without temporal direction is an oxymoron. 6 walls. None of them moved when I pushed. I find that notable. Here is the summary. God, as classical theism defines him, must be simple and omniscient. Proof 1 shows these are mathematically incompatible. Omnipotent, in the full sense. Proof 2 shows this is formally self-contradictory. Creator ex nihilo. Proof 3 shows this violates conservation of quantum information. Omnipresent in a physically efficacious sense. Proof 4 shows this violates QFT locality. Timeless and a free creator. Proof 5 shows these are temporally incompatible. Eternal and causally active. Proof 6 shows causation requires temporality that eternity excludes. 6 properties. 6 independent physical and logical constraints. Each one derived from among the most confirmed results in physics and mathematics. Together, they close around the classical theist God from 6 independent directions simultaneously. That is not a weakness in one argument. That is convergence. When 6 independent proofs from 6 independent branches of physics and logic all arrive at the same place, you are not looking at bias or selective reasoning. You are looking at what the universe is actually saying when you ask it the question carefully. The God of classical theism requires properties that are individually constrained by physics and collectively constrained by logic. 6 walls. 1 room. Nothing inside.